The stranger who came down from the mountain. In the world of martial arts, there are stories that masters tell in hushed tones. Not in gyms. Not in official competitions. But behind the scenes, after the cameras go off, after the referees leave, after only those who really live this world remain. One such story took place in December 1978, in the most unlikely place anyone could imagine for a martial arts tournament. Tibet. More specifically, in the vicinity of Mount Kailash, a sacred mountain that rises more than 6,600 meters above sea level, in the heart of the Tibetan plateau. A place where the air is so thin that walking becomes an effort. Where the December cold forgives no one. Where the sky seems closer than the earth. In this unlikely scenario, a select group of fighters came together. There was no television broadcast. There were no journalists. There were no golden trophies or cash prizes. There were only men who dedicated their lives to martial arts, and the desire to know who, in fact, was the best. The tournament was secret. And it was real. Participants came from different parts of the world. There were masters of styles that most people have never heard of. Men who carried decades of training on their bodies, scars from battles that never appeared in any book. But no one expected him. Nobody knew his name. No one knew where, exactly, he had come from. He arrived quietly, observed everything calmly, and when he was called to fight, he fought. And he won. Not anyway. He won in a way that left those present speechless. Experienced fighters, men who had seen it all on a mat, stood still, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Rumors that spread afterward said that he was African. That there was something about the way he moved that didn't fit into any known style. That he seemed completely at ease in an environment that would destroy any unprepared man, both from the cold and from his opponents. Who was this man? In the following years, his name began to appear in private conversations in martial arts circles. Always with respect. Sometimes with amazement. As if people were still processing what that day on top of the world had meant. Official sports history rarely talks about Mount Kailash in 1978. But those who were there, or who knew someone who was there, have never forgotten. And now you need to know. Who was the man who won a secret tournament on the roof of the world, and why did the martial arts world choose to keep him a secret? The man who learned where nobody dared to go. In the 1970s, there was a fighter who circulated through the closed martial arts circuits with a reputation that came before him. Ethiopian. High. Silent. When I entered a gym, others stopped training. But there are those who say that he never joined any gym. Who learned everything by himself, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where no instructor had ever set foot. What was known, or what was said to be known, was that he had started practicing martial arts as a child, influenced by the Ethiopian warrior tradition. A people who have never been colonized. A people who carried in history the memory of defeating empires. That said a lot about how he fought. His style had no name. I didn't go to school. It did not respect boundaries between systems. There was something of Tyre in him, the ancient Ethiopian way of fighting. There was something of a street fight. There was, according to some, something that no one could identify. A different version states that he did have a master. A single master. And that this master was not Ethiopian. This is where the story starts to get weird. Around 1975, 3 years before the tournament on Mount Kailash, a story was circulating behind the scenes of martial arts that few had the courage to repeat out loud. An Eastern master had arrived in Ethiopia. It wasn't a famous name. He wasn't a tournament champion. He was an old man, of uncertain origin. Some said Japanese, others said he came from an almost extinct Chinese lineage, who had been traveling for decades passing on knowledge that, according to himself, should no longer exist in the modern world. Another account contradicts all this. He says the old man didn't come to Ethiopia. That it was the fighter who came to him, and that the journey lasted months, crossing borders without documents, sleeping on the floor of train stations. The meeting between the two, wherever it happened, lasted long enough to change an entire life. No one knows exactly what was taught during that period. The few who claim to have been close describe things that don't make sense out of context, training that started before dawn and ended only when the body couldn't take it anymore. Techniques that mixed breathing, balance, and a way of reading the opponent that seemed almost impossible to explain. An Ethiopian military instructor who preferred to remain anonymous said years later that he saw the fighter stop an attack before the attacker had finished the movement. As if he knew what was coming before it came. Within martial circles, this type of skill has a name. But no one liked to say that name out loud, because saying it meant admitting that there was something beyond what the technique books taught. The Oriental Master, this character with no defined name, no known school, appears and disappears from the story like a shadow. Some say he died shortly after meeting the Ethiopian fighter. There are those who say that he simply stopped being seen. A third version claims that he is still alive, which is over 100 years old, and that the Ethiopian was the last student he accepted. What is known with more certainty, because there are at least 4 testimonies that, independently, say the same thing, is that after this period of training, the fighter changed. Not physically. Not in posture or muscles. It changed into something that is harder to describe. A different presence. A silence that was heavy. The feeling, according to those who fought him afterwards, that he knew where you were going to move before you decided yourself. A rival fighter who faced the Ethiopian in 1976 said, in an informal interview that was never published, "I didn't feel like I was fighting a man. I felt like I was fighting an idea." 3 years after this mysterious training, he climbed the most sacred mountain in the world for a tournament that did not exist in official records. And won. But the part that no one expected was not the victory. That's what happened after her. Because when asked about his master, about his teachings, about what he had learned in those months that transformed his way of fighting, the Ethiopian did something that no one understood at the time. He was silent for a long moment. And then he said, in a few words, that this matter was closed. He never returned to the topic. In no interview. In no recorded conversation. At no point in the public life that would come later. As if that knowledge was a debt he had promised not to reveal. But what exactly had he promised to keep, and why? What witnesses don't agree to say? Every story has an official version. And then there's what people say when they think no one is recording. With Ethiopian, the difference between these two versions was enormous. A student who trained with him in the early 1980s said, in an informal conversation recorded by an American martial arts researcher, he never talked about the past. If you asked, he would change the subject. If you insisted, the training ended there. The first person who tried to systematize reports about the Ethiopian fighter was a Japanese journalist called Kenji Muraoka, who between 1981 and 1984 traveled across parts of Asia and East Africa collecting testimonies from masters and fighters. Muraoka never published the book he planned to write. But his notebook circulated, photocopied, passed from hand to hand, within some specific martial arts circles. Fragments of this material reached people who still keep yellowed copies in personal files. A Brazilian instructor who had access to part of these notes in the 1990s described the content like this: it was like reading testimonies from people who had seen different things and thought they were talking about the same man. The reports didn't match up. And in fact, they didn't match. The first fundamental contradiction was about training with the Eastern Master. Some of the testimonies, especially those that came from fighters who knew him before 1975, described a man already formed, already dangerous, who didn't need any additional master to be what he was. For them, the story of the mysterious old man was exactly that, a story. A legend created later to explain something that didn't need a supernatural explanation. But a Hong Kong-based Hung Gar Kung Fu master, who asked not to be named, said the opposite. He stated that he had seen the Ethiopian before and after the training. And that they were, in his words, two completely different fighters in the same body. The rivalry between these two versions was not innocent. There was interest on both sides. The schools that wanted to diminish the Ethiopian's impact preferred the version in which he was just an exceptional athlete, talented, yes, but nothing more. Nothing that needed unusual explanations. The schools that admired him, or that had lost to him, preferred the version of the unknown master, the secret teaching, the inexplicable transformation. Because this version, in a way, made defeat easier to accept. A Thai fighter who competed on the same circuit in the 1970s said bluntly, "Nobody likes to admit they lost to someone who is simply better. It's more comfortable to say he had a secret." But there were details that escaped this narrative dispute. Small, human details that appeared in the reports in ways too similar to be coincidental. Several independent testimonies described the same behavior before fights. He arrived early. He stood still, observing the space. It didn't heat up. It didn't stretch. He just watched, as if he were reading something that no one else could see. A student who met him years later describes a different detail: he did warm up. But alone, away from everyone. Once I saw him by chance. They were very slow movements, almost like dancing. When he saw me, he stopped immediately. The issue of the tournament on Mount Kailash also generated conflicting versions. Some of those who claimed to have been present described an organized event, with clear rules, conducted with almost ceremonial seriousness. Others said it was much more chaotic, that some of the fights had no set rules, that there were moments of real tension, that not everyone walked away satisfied with the result. A former military instructor who preferred not to reveal which government he worked for at the time said the tournament had a purpose beyond sport. There were people there watching. Not to learn how to fight. To identify talent. For other purposes. This claim has never been confirmed. But it was also never completely discarded. What is known is that, in the months following the tournament, the Ethiopian disappeared from the informal circuits for almost 2 years. No public explanation. No announcement. When he reappeared, he was different again. More closed. More selective about who he trained with. I had fired, so to speak, almost all the regular students I had at the time. One of these dismissed students said decades later, he gave no explanation. He just said that what he taught before was no longer what he had to teach. I never understood what that meant. The rivalry between martial schools, the wounded pride of masters who could not decipher their style, the philosophical disputes about what was legitimate within the martial arts, all of this created an environment in which the truth about the Ethiopian was always buried under layers of interest and vanity. But there was one thing that almost everyone agreed on. Regardless of version. Regardless of side. Those who fought against him, or simply trained alongside him, left feeling like they had witnessed something they couldn't fully name. It wasn't strength, said a Japanese judo master who crossed paths with the Ethiopian in 1979. It wasn't speed. It was as if he knew something about combat that the rest of us were still trying to learn. And perhaps this is the question that none of the testimonies, none of the photocopied notebooks, none of the conflicting versions managed to truly answer. What exactly did he know? And where, after all, did he get it? What remains when the smoke clears? There is a curious phenomenon that happens with stories like this. Over time, the details that should be lost, the small ones, the peripheral ones, the seemingly unimportant ones, are exactly the ones that survive. And the big details, the ones that should be easy to confirm, are the ones that disappear. With the Ethiopian, it was exactly like that. No one knows the exact date of the tournament on Mount Kailash. But 3 independent testimonies describe, in precise detail, the color of the coat he was wearing when he arrived. When you put all the accounts side by side, Muraoka's notebooks, the informal testimonies, the stories passed down within the academies, some patterns emerge with a consistency that is difficult to ignore. First, No one who fought against him can describe what, technically, he did. Experienced fighters, men with decades on the mat, always use the same vague words. Different. Impossible to anticipate. As if he was in a rhythm that wasn't the fight. Second, there are techniques mentioned in several reports that have never been publicly demonstrated. One in particular appears described in slightly different ways in at least 6 separate testimonies, a neutralizing movement that, according to those who describe it, rendered the opponent's strength completely useless. As if the impact just disappeared. Third, the most important events in his career do not have official records. The tournament in Tibet does not exist in any archive. The period of training with the Oriental master left no documents. The 2 years of disappearance after December 1978 are a complete void. A martial arts researcher who spent years trying to document the Asian closed circuit of the 1970s said, "It's as if someone had passed by, erasing the footprints. Not in a dramatic way. Just, leaving nothing behind." Given these patterns, at least 3 main hypotheses have emerged over the years that still circulate today among those who know this story. Hypothesis 1, Forbidden knowledge. The oldest theory, and the one with the most followers in traditional circles, is that the Oriental master who trained the Ethiopian was the guardian of a combat system that had been deliberately removed from circulation. Not because it is ineffective. For the opposite reason. There is within some Asian martial traditions the concept of techniques that are considered too dangerous for broad teaching. Not because they hurt the opponent, all martial arts do that. But because, according to this tradition, they permanently alter the way the practitioner perceives combat. They create, in simple terms, an advantage that cannot be unlearned. A master from Baguazhang consulted on this matter said only, "There is knowledge that has not been lost. It has been kept." There is a difference. According to this hypothesis, the Ethiopian would have received exactly this type of teaching. And the silence he maintained afterwards would not be due to personal choice, it would be part of a commitment made to the master himself. Hypothesis 2, the fight that shouldn't have happened. The second theory is more concrete, more human, and therefore perhaps more disturbing. Some reports suggest that the tournament on Mount Kailash was not just a tournament. That at some point in that December 1978, there was a specific fight, outside the program, outside the rules, that involved the Ethiopian and a representative of a highly prestigious traditional martial school. A school that didn't lose well. There was pride at stake, said one fighter who claimed to have heard the story directly from a participant. It wasn't about who was better. It was about what it would mean for that school to be defeated by someone outside of any known tradition. According to this hypothesis, the Ethiopian's silence was protection, not necessarily for himself, but to avoid a greater conflict within the martial world. A publicly admitted defeat could have consequences that went beyond sport. This theory would explain the 2 years of disappearance. And the change in behavior afterwards. Hypothesis 3, he just decided to stop. The third hypothesis is the least dramatic. And perhaps that's why it's the one that least people want to accept. Some of those who knew him personally, not as a legendary figure, but as an ordinary man, with routine and tiredness and doubts, believe that silence was simply a choice. That he reached a point where he decided that what he had learned, what he had experienced, belonged to him. Just him. Not all knowledge needs to be shared, said a woman who said she had been his student for almost a year. He said that sometimes. I thought it was philosophy. Then I realized it was politics. Today, decades later, the Ethiopian story still circulates. Not in books. Not in documentaries. But in conversations between masters, in academies where older students sometimes mention a name, or avoid mentioning it, when the subject of training goes deep enough. There is an academy in Japan where they say one of the senior instructors was on Mount Kailash in 1978. He never confirmed or denied it. But when the topic comes up, he closes his eyes for a moment before responding. There is a book published in Ethiopian, in the 1990s, on the history of the country's warrior traditions, which has a curiously short, almost rushed, chapter about an unnamed fighter from the modern era. As if the author knew more than he was authorized to write. A copy of this book was found, with marginal notes in 3 different languages, in a used bookstore in Addis Ababa. No one knows who took the notes. Nobody managed to translate them all. What is certain is that history is not dead. It continues to move, from word to mouth, from gym to gym, from generation to generation, with the same strange characteristic that marked the very man at its center. Impossible to fix completely. Impossible to completely discard. Like a movement you saw but can't replicate. Like a technique that someone described to you, but that only makes sense if you experience it yourself. Perhaps only a handful of people in the world know what really happened that December 1978, high on a sacred mountain in Tibet. And if they know, they haven't said it yet.